Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Please feel free as we wait for others to sign in to introduce yourself and your organization in the chat. And we're just going to get started here in about 2 minutes. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat while we wait just 1 or 2 more minutes to start today's webinar. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Please feel free to continue to introduce yourself, your organization, and the country in the chat. We're just going to wait about 1 more minute before we get started. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started now, and others will continue to join us. Thank you again for joining today's webinar on business development. I'm going to start with a couple of intro slides on the ASAP2 project and then hand it over to Rebecca Bowler, today's presenter. Welcome again. Continue to introduce yourselves if you haven't already in the chat. You can go ahead and tell us your name, perhaps your job position if you're comfortable, and what organization you're calling in from in the chat. Throughout today's webinar, we'll stop for questions once and of course answer questions at the end. At any point during the webinar, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box. Myself and Rebecca will be monitoring those questions so that they can get answered for you throughout today's webinar. We also have 3 polls during the webinar. At those particular points, a poll or quiz questions will come up on your screen. So please, we encourage you to participate in those as we love to interact with you and see where you are in terms of business development. The presentation, as well as a recording of today's webinar, will be available on the ASAP2 website at www.intrahealth.org/ASAP-resources, and I'll send that link in the chat shortly. The recording and presentations will be available by the end of the day Eastern Standard Time, and tomorrow, of course, for everyone who is perhaps finished working by that time. This is what the ASAP resources page looks like. USAID and ASAP have broadcasted over 100 webinars for more than 21,000 attendees in 76 different countries. Many of our webinars we do in 3 languages. So English, of course, as we are doing today, French and Portuguese. So if you yourself or you have colleagues who prefer French or Portuguese, many of our webinars are available in those languages. And of course, all of those resources are available to you at any time. So please have a look at our past webinars as well as other tools and resources on that website available for you and your team to use. We have a couple upcoming webinars in the next couple of weeks. The first is a procurement and property management compliance webinar on February 28th, and a USAID financial policies, internal controls, and compliance webinar on March 5th. So please register for those if you are at all interested in attending, or share with colleagues who you think might be interested in those topics. We also have several communities of practice in English, French, and Portuguese. If you're interested in those, please register. There's often excellent conversation amongst colleagues in these various topics: monitoring and evaluation, leadership and governance, and finance management and compliance, depending on which language you prefer. So I will again send this link in the chat shortly for you all to register if you're interested. Today's facilitators, today we have Rebecca Buller, our business development consultant, and also was a presenter at the 4th annual USAID Global Health Local Partner Meeting in Johannesburg. And we're excited to have Rebecca back with us. She's an excellent presenter, so please ask questions as she is an expert. So Rebecca, I'll pass it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Melissa, for that introduction. Welcome, everyone. Great to be with you today. If I've met you before, great to see you again. I know I've done some of these webinars with ASAP before, as well as being at the local partners meeting. So it's fantastic to be with you again today. So our objective and agenda today, just quickly, our objective is to provide some best practices for identifying potential funding opportunities, preparing for and responding to USG funded opportunities, and undertaking post-submission activities to better position your organization for the future. A link to the webinar recording and presentation materials will be shared afterwards, so please look out for those. Our agenda today, we're going to go through a lot of topics. It's going to be a packed 2 hours of information. So please put your questions in the chat box and we'll do our best to get to all those today. But first, we're going to go through some best practices for identifying opportunities for funding and making a go decision. And then we're going to talk about pre-planning for the opportunity release, and then getting into responding to the technical applications requirements and meeting the evaluation criteria. Then we'll pause for questions and answers, and then the latter half of the presentation will be about responding to cost application requirements, finalizing and submitting your application, and then incorporating post-submission best practices into your BD processes. And then we'll have more time for Q&A at the end. For right now, like Melissa mentioned, we're going to ask you a couple of poll questions. So please, it should pop up in your screen and answer the couple of questions we have for you. Okay, so it should have popped up here. So the first question is, has your organization responded to a USAID funded EOI or request for application before, either directly to USAID or through a USAID prime partner? And then there's a few questions on which aspects of the application development process are of most concern to you. So one being the most concerning, something that you're worried about or feel like you don't have the processes in place for. And 5 is the least concerning, something that you feel like you can do easily, have done before. So the first question in that is if you're concerned about having adequate staff or resources to pull applications together, understanding the requirements of the application, designing and explaining your technical approach, getting your budget developed to reflect your technical approach, or understanding the eventual award mechanism, which could potentially be a fixed amount award or a cooperative agreement. So we'll give you a moment to lock in your answers there.
Just give folks another 15 to 20 seconds.
Okay. So we have our poll question responses pulled up here. So yes, the answer to the first question is overwhelmingly yes. You have responded to a USAID funded request, either yourself or through a prime partner. So we have a lot of pros in the room. For those that answered no, happy to have you here, and hopefully you'll be in the yes column soon. Going on to which aspects of the application might be of most concern. I think for the first question, having staff resources doesn't seem to be a huge concern. It's about in the 3 to 4 range, so that's good. Understanding the requirements, kind of right in the middle there at number 3, of somewhat concern, but not overwhelmingly of concern. Designing your technical application, have a little more on the most concerning side. Totally understandable. Those are the biggest pieces of the proposal that you submit. Developing the budget seems to be second there of concern. And then finally, understanding the award mechanism. It's kind of spread across there, but not the most concerning, but of concern for some. But perhaps some are also pros of that as well. So, all right. Thank you so much for letting us know your experience in these aspects, and that will help us as we move forward. So we'll go ahead and get right into it. And talking about identifying opportunities. So hopefully when your organization is thinking about your funding and planning out, your year and how you're going to fund your work, you're thinking ahead to how can we, connect with the donor? How can we understand what USAID and other donors are looking to fund? So oftentimes, hopefully this is happening before you see a final RFA or, have the donor asking you to apply to something. The different ways, you can identify opportunities for funding. First and foremost, direct outreach from the donor. Perhaps the donor knows your organization for your particular knowledge and expertise, or working with a particular target population or in a particular geography. So they're coming hopefully to you as the expert in that area. Another way to find out about funding opportunities is by word of mouth from your networks, from your colleagues, former colleagues that are at other organizations, or maybe working at the donor now, other stakeholders, other donors, working with USAID, when other projects are ending, perhaps there'll be a follow-on coming. You kind of have to read the tea leaves a little bit sometimes. And it's also important for you to become familiar with USAID's country development cooperation strategy for your country. This is where USAID puts out usually a 5-year strategy document that lets you know what are USAID's priorities over the next 5 years. What are they looking to fund? Was it health programming, education programming, agriculture, food security, economic growth? All of those different subjects would be found in that cooperation strategy. And that's also something that you can connect with USAID to discuss. And then when we get into the official USAID sites, and this is particular for USAID, but also for the rest of the US government agencies. The USAID Business Forecast, hopefully you're familiar with the forecast. This is where USAID publishes its intentions for funding different projects. It'll usually give you, timing of when the RFA would be released, how much the award will be worth, and those other details, which I'll have an example to show you in a few slides. Grants.gov is where USAID and other US agencies publish their calls for grant and cooperative agreement opportunities. And then SAM.gov is where USAID and other agencies publish their contract opportunities. And then, of course, outside of US government funders, looking at websites for foundations, corporations, other INGOs, if you're looking for a prime partner on a certain opportunity, INGOs also put out requests for funding opportunities. So hopefully you're familiar with USAID Business Forecast. They've revamped their website, so it looks a little bit different than what I had been used to for a number of years. But this is the landing page for the forecast. So you can see there are several places to, look for, filtering opportunities. And, if you know the name of the opportunity or, of course, looking by country or by, different USAID bureau, global health or economic growth, you can search by all of these different functions. And so primarily when I'm looking at this site, I'm going by country because I know what country, I'm expecting opportunities to come out of, or I'm interested in what USAID says it's planning to fund in a particular country. So that's an easy way to do it and to capture all those different opportunities, regardless if it's PEPFAR or economic growth, etc. And then once you find, you choose your country, and this is just an example. It's PEPFAR funded for South Africa. And so some key things to keep in mind when you're looking at these search findings. It has all of the information here, which country, what sector, where is the funding coming from, award length, eligibility criteria. So all of these are important for you to pay attention to. So like I said, first and foremost, looking at, oops. Okay. First, looking at the sector. So of course, ASAP is helping PEPFAR funded organizations like yourselves or that are interested in PEPFAR funding, becoming prime partners for PEPFAR. So understanding what sector, who is the funding coming from, HIV/AIDS, of course, for PEPFAR. Another important thing to take a look at is the eligibility criteria. So this is important for you all as local partners. USAID will say if only local partners are allowed to bid on these opportunities, or if it's unrestricted, it'll say free and open. So local partners could bid, or INGOs. It'll be kind of everybody's eligible and able to bid. And then another important thing to look at is the anticipated solicitation release date. So this was slated for the 13th of February. It is out live now, as some of you might know. But that's important. These dates aren't hard and fast. They're not set in stone. But it does give you an idea of when USAID is anticipating to release. So it's important to kind of check through these on a regular basis so you can see when USAID is updating these opportunities, what kind of information they're adding, etc. And then finally, looking at the total estimated cost. So that's what they're saying the anticipated ceiling, budget ceiling is for that project. So, this one is 50 to 100 million, very, very large. But it gives you an idea of kind of what to plan for. So it's very helpful. USAID also does a quarterly Q&A about the forecast that you can submit questions and ask questions about the forecast and their plans for funding. And I'll just give you a brief insight into grants.gov. Again, hopefully you're familiar with this website, but going to the top, when you navigate to grants.gov, there's a search grants function. And to the left side, you can see opportunity status, which is forecasted or posted. So anything that's live that USAID says, yes, please start putting in your applications, or plan to put in your application. Sometimes they put forecasted opportunities on there. This inset on the top right, it's on the left side of the actual website, but I couldn't fit it all on this page. So just to draw your attention that you can search grants.gov by agency, and you can choose Agency for International Development. So another place to be sure to check for forecasted or live opportunities from U.S. government agencies, particularly USAID. So once you've had a chance to identify opportunities, and hopefully before it's gone live, so you have time to do some pre-planning and preparing. But just thinking about what information you need to consider before making a go decision. So you find something on the forecast or find something forecasted on the grants.gov website. Some things to keep in mind when you're making a go decision. So is the project within your experience and expertise? Um, is it in your wheelhouse, or does it cover everything that you do already in your programming? Or does it have some areas that might be a stretch or a goal for your organization to reach for? Or does it have gaps that are just a plain gap? And your organization wouldn't be well placed to implement those particular pieces. So it's important to kind of balance, what could you take on versus what you might need a partner for. And then you really have to think about, is this project strategic for the growth and expansion of your organization and its mission? Is it going to advance your work? Is it going to serve the populations that you work with? Is it working in the geographic area that you're interested or able to operate in? And just in general, is it, supporting your mission to drive your, goals forward? And then, is it being implemented, being awarded through a mechanism that your organization can implement? So, if it's a grant or a cooperative agreement, that will probably be, what kind of award you need to look at. If it's a contract, those are much different and have a lot more stringent policies and procedures that organizations need to follow. So you just need to make sure that, if everything else is a yes, but it's in a different mechanism that you would have to implement. You have to really consider if you're able to implement that way. And finally, is the project presenting any risks? And if so, can those be mitigated? So if it's being implemented in a geographic area that you don't operate in, that's challenging to operate in, are you willing to take the risk and to do the risk assessments necessary to say, yes, we can go in and work in that particular area, or we can work with this particular target group? Just things, even in terms again of the award mechanism, is it a risk? Are there things we need to do to beef up our own policies and procedures to make sure that we're implementing this according to the rules and regulations that USAID presents? And then finally, and sometimes most importantly, do you have the internal resources to pull together a high quality application by the deadline? So you might be making a go decision months before the actual opportunity is posted and has deadline. But then when the opportunity is finally posted and the deadline's given, but you're working on another proposal or your team is at a, yearly strategic meeting retreat that takes everybody out of the office for a week, how will these different factors impact your ability to put that application together? So all very important things to think about as you're preparing. And so assuming you've made a go decision, you say yes to all of those questions, we can put the proposal together, we know we can cover all the important areas, or we have partners that we can work with. We talk about capture. So capture is kind of a very US business type of language, but it's really pre-planning for the opportunity. What can you do ahead of that final RFA release to make sure that you're well placed and not scrambling at the end and, hoping you can put all the pieces together in a matter of weeks. So capture is an opportunity specific process following a go decision that continues until the opportunity is released. So again, this is for competitive opportunities. If the donor has approached you and it's not a competitive process, this is probably not as important. But if you're, going to be competing against other organizations, local or INGOs, it's really important to do this kind of pre-planning process to make sure you're well placed. So capture can include a thorough assessment of the opportunity. What information do you have? Is it from the forecast or is it from word of mouth from the donor or other stakeholders? Especially for competitive processes, doing an analysis of the competition. So who else might be bidding on this? What other organizations might be looking at this opportunity, and how can you capitalize on perhaps their weaknesses or challenges that they've faced in implementing similar projects, or what do you need to do as an organization to make sure that you're demonstrating that you can implement a program better than that competition. And you also need to look inward. So doing an assessment of your own organization's technical capabilities, being very honest about any of your strengths and any of your weaknesses when you've implemented programs with USAID or other donors, when you've worked with a specific target population or in a geography. Did you have challenges? How did you overcome them? Just really being critical internally of what kind of questions is the donor going to ask and we have to answer for. And taking all of this information will then inform your strategy to resource the proposal effort and identifying your proposal team. It will inform your partnering strategy and how you want to begin to build your consortium if you need partners to fill in any gaps. And it will also begin to inform your initial technical management and budgeting strategies. So once you have all of this information, you can kind of begin to say, okay, these are the technical strategies, these are the approaches that our organization has to address this particular issue, and these are the type of staffing or office structure that we have, and this is how we will budget for it. And then you'll also want to start thinking about recruiting key personnel. Again, this is usually a requirement of USAID proposals, is to identify your key personnel, those staff positions that are very important and key to the implementation of the project. And usually you have to identify those staff and provide their CVs in that application to USAID. So some things to think about when identifying your team internally. I know a lot of you, your local organizations, you might not have a full BD team that's separate from your technical folks and your M&E folks and your finance folks. So you really want to think about what are some different functions that need to be covered, which might be covered by, one person might cover more than one of these functions, but it's important to think about all of them as you're going through the process. So having someone that's really has their eye on process management, usually this is someone from a business development team, but it might be someone on your technical team or someone from your admin staff or operations folks. But making sure that someone is there to manage the process, keep everyone moving towards deadlines and moving towards getting your inputs together and getting deliverables. And then you need a writer, someone who's actually going to put, old school pen to paper or, fingers to the keyboard and typing out your actual technical narrative and the pieces that need to be submitted to the donor. So someone who will be responsible for creating your outline and writing the proposal, of course, with inputs from your technical team. So ensuring that you have technical expertise, including M&E as needed. And then you need folks to develop the budget. So probably someone on your finance team, but they're going to have to work hand in hand with those technical experts who are designing the project, designing the activities, and working closely with operations and human resources. Deciding if you need to open additional offices. Do you need to have operations in a different geographic area than you're used to working? Do you need to open a new office there, or are you going to co-locate with a partner or a government office? And then human resources, how are you going to hire the staff? Do you need to hire more staff to implement the project? Getting those advertisements out, the JDs posted, screening and interviewing candidates, all very important aspects of the process. And then finally, you need to think about having reviewers for each of these pieces. So reviewers for the technical and for the budget. Once you're have that evaluation criteria from USAID, you really need folks from outside of the proposal process to be able to review your technical application and your budget to make sure they're meeting those criteria and reflecting your technical design. And we'll get into more about reviewing later. But we'll talk about now forming your team externally. So we've talked about, having considerations for partnerships and things that you need to consider. Can you implement this project on your own, or do you need to partner with other organizations that have different expertise than you to ensure that you're covering all of the aspects of the potential project? So things to consider first and foremost, do you want a prime or do you want a sub? Do you want to work with another partner that will be the prime and will put together the application and will lead the project during implementation? And then once you've kind of identified, how you want to take on the opportunity, thinking about what are the complementary versus overlapping areas of technical expertise or geographic presence to consider. Why might you need a partner to work with? Do they fill a gap in your technical expertise, or do they work in a geographic area with a certain particular target population that you haven't worked with before, and they have, links to that community and can make entry into that community more effective? And you also need to think about, does the organization have a good reputation? Do they have credibility doing this work with the community? Have they been working in this particular geographic region or with this population before? Have they had issues or challenges in projects that they've implemented before? You want to make sure you're putting your best foot forward as a team if you decide to go together, and being honest about any challenges or how to mitigate any risks is also really important. And another consideration, have they worked with this donor or this funder before? Do they have experience working with USAID or CDC or, any other potential donors, non-USG donors? Do they have that experience? Do they know the policies and processes, and they can meet all the requirements of the award after, while you're implementing? And so, lots of things to consider. And then you really want to have meetings with potential partners to discuss, impressions of the potential project or the solicitation and potential areas of collaboration. So, once you've had those discussions and you've made those decisions and you say, okay, yes, we want to partner with this organization over here, then, working towards finalizing the partnership terms and formalizing the relationship. So that's just a very quick overview of this process that can, take many weeks or even months to finalize. So just some things to think about. So, you've done a lot of this pre-planning, and you've hopefully, gotten your partnerships together, and you've begun thinking about your technical approach, and you've identified some key personnel, and then the bid goes live. So this obviously is for an imaginary land called Avaliza. And the proposal came out way back in 2021, but this is just an example. We all know how these solicitations from USAID look. So, that bid has gone live. It's posted on grants.gov. Here is the information, your deadlines and your closing date. And usually the first emotion is to panic. But hopefully you've been doing all this pre-planning, you've been preparing your team, you have your partners identified, there's no reason to panic because you're prepared, you're ready. You were just waiting for that final RFA to come out. But of course, nothing's a done deal. You've done a lot of planning, but perhaps there's new information in that final solicitation. Maybe there's a new aspect to the technical programming that you hadn't anticipated, or there's other personnel staff that you need to identify, or maybe the funding ceiling is not as high as you thought it was, and it's lower, and you need to rethink some of your programming to fit within the budget ceiling. So we're going to go through some best practices once that solicitation goes live so that you can lay a foundation in those first few hours and days to make sure that you're following a good process to that deadline. So of course, the first thing is to review the documents. Oftentimes USAID and other donors will release the solicitation document. So that's the RFA, that's the notice of funding opportunity, NOFO. So you have this document, perhaps they've also provided budget templates or other annexes or attachments that are necessary for putting your application together. So it's just really important to read and review the documents from top to bottom. And that includes everybody on the proposal team or anyone that will be involved with putting your application together. It's really, really important for everyone to read all of the documents. Even if your finance staff won't be working necessarily on the technical approach or helping design the technical approach, they need to be aware of what aspects might go into that budget. So it's just really important to emphasize to everybody on your team that everyone needs to read all of the documents so nothing is lost. So while you're reviewing the solicitation documents, it's really important to take note of course, the key dates and deadlines. So when are questions due? When is the final deadline? Is there a bidders conference that's happening sometime in the next week or two? Just taking points on those important deadlines. And then ensuring that you understand the award information and eligibility requirements to ensure you're eligible to apply. So is this opportunity restricted to local organizations only? Is it open competition where INGOs and non-US organizations might apply? It is really important to make sure you understand that yes, you're eligible to apply and understanding, the eventual award mechanism that might be used. Of course, USAID solicitations in particular give very strict instructions on application format. So they'll tell you kind of what format, they'll even tell you font size, page limits, what you should put in your headers and your footers, or outline the specific sections that are required within your application. So just making sure you understand when you submit that final document, what should it look like and what format it should be in. And then finally, paying close attention to the evaluation criteria. Ensuring, first and foremost, this is the most important part about submitting your application, is ensuring that it meets the evaluation criteria set forth in the solicitation and that the reviewers can easily see them in your application. You want to be able, when you submit your application, you want USAID or host government officials to be able to go through your application and check off, did this organization present their technical application clearly? Did they include an organizational chart? Things like that. You just want to make it very easy for the reviewers to see that you responded to all the requirements. And so next, it's really important to put together your very detailed proposal calendar. I know this is quite small, but as you can see, it's based on the release of the solicitation that I showed a couple of slides ago. So a proposal calendar is a really important tool that we use in business development to ensure that everyone is aware of all of the deadlines. And it's not just, the application is due to USAID on the 29th, but working back from that final application date, what are the intermediary deadlines? So when does the whole thing need to be have the final review and sign off? When do we need to do copy editing? When do we need to make sure all of the sections, including the CVs, are finalized, and when we need to have the final budget? So a best practice for putting your proposal calendar together is really working backward from that final deadline. So you know how and when to fit in all of these important, technical meetings and getting inputs from your partners and ensuring that, you're asking questions to USAID by the deadline. Sometimes proposal calendars can be pretty scary to look at. You think, okay, we have 6 weeks. That's a long time. But in proposal development world, um, it'll go by very quickly, and you have a lot to do in that short amount of time. But it's great to have that final RFA and, work towards that final goal of submission, since you've hopefully been preparing for several weeks, months, or even years at this time. Another important tool that I use is called a compliance matrix. So this is a template that I use and has been used across organizations to kind of distill down into a condensed document. What are those key deadlines? What are the key proposal requirements? What are those evaluation criteria? All distilled into one document. Solicitations can often be over 100 pages, and there's a lot of requirements on different pages throughout that. There's no one page in the solicitation that's going to tell you everything you need to know. So this is really a template and a tool to distill down all of those requirements, all of those specifics that are down to, what type of font size should you use, how big should the margins be, but also, understanding when you need to submit questions and how much is the technical approach worth. So I would definitely encourage you, if you haven't used one of these before, to find a template, or I think ASAP might have resources on this they can provide. But to allow you to kind of distill down, this is very useful when the deadline's approaching and you're preparing your application for submission. This is kind of a one-stop place to find all the important information. And then, an important part of the proposal development process is asking questions to the donor. So you'll see on every solicitation from USAID or other US agencies that they give you a deadline to ask questions about the document. So this is an opportunity to clarify any instructions or information that might be unclear or contradictory. And a best practice on how to put questions together, it's actually one of my favorite parts of the proposal development process, is framing the question in a way that a donor can easily answer. Don't ask a question that will give away your technical approach or your strategy or other important information, especially if it's a competitive process. When USAID receives all of the questions, they'll consolidate them, they'll answer them, and then they'll post them back on grants.gov or, whatever platform they use to advertise the solicitation. So you have to keep in mind that any question you ask, other competitors will see that question and see that answer. So you just want to be very strategic in the types of questions you ask and make sure that USAID can give you a clear response. And something else to ask yourself, do you really need to ask the question, or can you make an assumption and move forward? So this is really kind of a nuanced, question to ask yourself. If it's about, using a particular strategy or working with a particular stakeholder, USAID might not give you a clear answer. And so it might be important for you to just kind of make an assumption, as long as it's not, an assumption about a requirement that is, basic to the proposal application. But, after doing this for some years, you kind of get an idea of things that you should ask and maybe things that you don't. So um, we'll go through an example here um, of a question to a donor. So this example is, the technical application. So, the instructions say that it must be consecutively numbered on each page and must not exceed 30 pages. And then in parentheses, it says not including a cover page, table of contents, executive summary, appendices. So in the solicitation, it lists all of these out. It says how many pages are allotted for each, but it doesn't actually indicate if you should include an acronym list. As you know, with USAID and other US government donors, we use a lot of acronyms, and sometimes you really need an acronym list to make sure that everything is clear and that, someone isn't wondering, oh, what does that mean? So, you ask yourself, should we ask a question about an acronym list since it's not listed, but it is usually required in most USAID solicitations. So, in thinking about this, if you say yes, we should ask a question, I'll give you a couple examples here. So, one question you could ask is which sections of the technical application do not count towards the 30-page limit? Yes, that covers the question. It kind of covers the question, but it's not very specific. And so potentially, USAID could just say, go back to the page that we listed all the requirements on, which, doesn't really answer your question. But from the donor's perspective, they did give you a list of what does not count towards the page limit. So, they're pointing you back to that. Or they might say, appendices don't count towards the page limit. So again, it's very unclear, what exactly you're referring to in this question. And so it's challenging for the donor to give you that specific answer. So a better question would be phrased in this way, referring to the page number in the NOFO. It says that the cover page, table of contents, executive summary, and appendices do not count towards the 30-page limit. Can you please confirm that an acronym list may also be included and not count towards the 30-page limit? So you can see this is a much longer question, but it points the donor back to the specific page of the NOFO that this information is found on, letting them know that you've read this information and that you understand that these pieces don't count towards the page limit, but you want them to confirm, which would be a yes or no answer, that an acronym list may be also included and not count towards the page limit. So, this makes it easy for the donor to say yes or no. So like I said, the potential answer could be yes or no. So again, making it as easy for the donor as possible while also getting a specific answer for yourself is really the best way to go about asking any questions. There's other examples we could use of this. Unfortunately, we don't have time for more, but just a very simple example of how you might phrase questions like this. And so we'll get into the technical application here, some best practices for that. And we have a few more slides and then we'll get to the Q&A. So for the technical application, some of the best practices for responding to the requirements and meeting the evaluation criteria include one, creating your outline, creating your template, based on the instructions and requirements in the solicitation, create your outline in Word, make sure it meets the specific font size, margins, and other requirements. And then make sure you're creating headings for each of the sections required and note those page limits. So usually you'll be asked for a technical approach. You'll be asked potentially for a monitoring and evaluation section, a section on management and staffing, a section on organizational capability. And so depending on, the evaluation criteria and how much these sections are worth, that will really point you to how many pages to give each of those sections. So usually the technical approach is worth the most points. So you want to make sure that you're giving the most pages to that piece of the application. And then when you want to get into, creating the meat of your technical approach, deciding what your approach is, deciding what strategies and activities you're going to implement, it's really important to hold, in-person meetings or, of course, virtual meetings with your technical experts, partner staff, operations, finance, HR. It takes a village to put a proposal together. So making sure all of these different units are represented and can input properly at all stages of the process. And you really want to talk about the context of the issues. What is the problem? What are the challenges? And then talking about the root causes of those challenges. Why does this issue exist? And how can we get to the root of why it exists? And then from that root cause, deciding what your potential solutions are to address those root causes. What are potential solutions, strategies, approaches that are going to make a change for that root cause? And then when you're solutioning, then you're going through activities or tasks to operationalize those solutions. So what activities do you need to undertake or take place to bring out those potential solutions? Do you need to have trainings with community health workers? Do you need to hold policy strategy meetings with the Ministry of Health to change something on the policy side? Do you need to work with other stakeholders or other donors to coordinate activities to make sure that there's no duplication or, there's not conflicting activities going on, and to make sure that everything is consistent? And then, when you have these activities in mind and what you need to do, who are the staff needed to implement these activities? What kind of staff do you need to hire onto the project to, facilitate those trainings or to go work with those community health workers or, undertake, supportive supervision activities? Who are the staff that you need to have working for the project to put these activities in place? And then going back to your monitoring and evaluation, what are indicators that you need to monitor to show progress as you're implementing activities? How are you going to demonstrate to USAID and the community that you're making progress and using, project funds to make and, achieve results for those activities? And then, getting together, I'm sure a lot of you have gotten together in a room and you get sticky notes or whiteboards or chart paper, using whatever kind of resources you have to facilitate these discussions easily, and grouping them according to objectives. There's also several virtual kind of whiteboard or sticky note applications that you can use. Miro, Mural are a couple of those. Of course, in Zoom and in Google Meet, there's a whiteboard function. So you can also, do those virtually. It takes a little more, I think, effort to properly facilitate those, but it can be done. As we know, we were doing a lot more virtually than we were several years ago. So just, make sure that you know what kind of tools to use are out there to facilitate these important conversations. And, when you're putting your activities together, it's important to remember what USAID is looking for. So they're going to want to know what is the activity. And it's important to kind of answer these questions or make sure you're being clear about these in writing your technical approach. So what is the activity? How will the activity or task be completed? What stakeholders or other factors need to be taken into account? And that can include where. So where will the activity geographically take place? Will the training be in a conference center, or will it be in the community health center? Just being specific about where things are taking place. Another important question to answer is who. So if you are working with your partner organizations and your consortium, it's important to be clear about which organization is leading activity. Will partner support in any way? Will a partner lead a certain activity or objective for the project? And even getting into which specific staff will lead or support activities. So will your chief of party, facilitate some sort of meeting with government stakeholders, or will your SBC specialist, be facilitating a training with community health workers? Just being very specific about which staff and which organization is doing what. That will really help USAID understand how you're operationalizing these activities. And making sure you say when. So this could be contained in a work plan or, within your meal plan. But when will the activity take place? Is this a startup activity that's taking place in month 1? Or is it an implementation task that will take place in year 3? Again, this is also very important. All of these questions and answers are very important for your budget. I think your budget lead will really appreciate knowing all of this information in order to get it into the budget properly. So again, ensuring, it's really important to ensure that all of your technical activities are feasible and within the allocated budget. We all know we could design an amazing project touching every piece of the puzzle, every, person in the area for $100 million. But if you only have $10 million to work with, what is feasible to accomplish, and how can you do that within that budget ceiling? And so another important piece of the technical proposal is your management and staffing plan. So this plan describes how you will identify and work with partners or subrecipients, what the established lines of authority, communication, and reporting are. And it will also show how you've assigned staff to key roles and how you'll obtain additional technical expertise as needed. So again, this would include, talking about and describing the roles and responsibilities of your key personnel and perhaps non-key personnel that are essential to the project, and including CVs for those key personnel who are usually requested to be displayed in the annex and describe and demonstrate their qualifications and meeting the requirements. So just like with the technical approach, there's a lot of pieces that go into the management and staffing plan, but it's important to think of, okay, this management and staffing plan is really following off of your technical approach and what you say those activities and essential pieces of work are, that this is how you're going to operationalize. These are the offices that are going to support that work, and these are the staff that are going to implement it. And then another important piece of the management and staffing plan is usually presenting an organizational chart. So this is a graphic demonstration of, what your team will look like. And as you can see in this, work chart here, there's a key to tell you which staff are key personnel, what project office certain staff will be based in, if they'll be in the facility, and which staff, belong to your partner. So USAID normally asks for this so they can understand, visually how you plan to operationalize the project. Um, I would say for tips on this part, it's really important to develop your org chart as early as possible and to cost it out to ensure that it's feasible. So again, you could, hire 100 staff people to implement a project, but if you don't have the right budget ceiling, that's just not going to be feasible. So understanding how many staff you need and at what level, what are their salary levels? What is the cost of opening a new office versus co-locating with another partner? These all have cost implications that are really important to think about and that you might have to end up, rethinking depending on, how things come out in the budget. Showing key positions that will be held by both your organization and consortium partners. Again, this will help USAID understand, okay, these are the primes, positions, these are the prime personnel that are going to staff the project, and these are where the consortium partners fit in. Again, talking about which offices they're based in, and you really have to think about adjusting the staffing configuration according to the type of project. So if you're doing a service delivery project, that work chart and that staffing plan will look different than a technical assistance project. If you're just simply, providing expertise to staff that are, community health workers or those working in the Ministry of Health, that will look a lot different than if you're providing staff to do direct service delivery or support those, hospitals or community health centers. So other things to consider. And again, ensuring that the appropriate proportions of funding are going to staff versus activities. It's very easy for a budget to be overrun with staffing costs or, office costs. And then you see not a lot of the budget is going to activities. And it's really important to make sure you balance and look at that from a larger picture of, how much are we spending on staff versus, what are we actually doing in activities. And then you have a monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan. I could have some different names, but usually in your application, you'll have to talk about how you plan to monitor and evaluate your program activities. So, that can include identifying your program goals and objectives and defining indicators, both output and outcome indicators. And sometimes these are provided in the RFA. Some are USAID standard indicators. You can create custom indicators. Just, things to keep in mind, and your MEL staff will be better versed in this than I am. But you'll also in this plan need to define and your data collection methods, the timeline for when you're going to collect data, identifying M&E roles and responsibilities for staff, creating analysis plan and reporting templates, and then a plan for disseminating these, learnings or results and donor reporting. So these are some of the main aspects asked in this particular section. It can vary from, proposal to proposal. So it's just important to have in mind that you will need to account for this in your application. And then organizational capacity and history performance. Again, this is usually requested in USAID applications. Organizational capacity usually appears within the narrative of the technical application. And it's really a chance in this section for you to demonstrate that you can perform the scope of work of the opportunity by describing past and current work related to that scope of work. So you can show USAID, yes, we've been doing this type of work in another geography or, with a different population, but that experience, is applicable to this opportunity we're applying for here. And usually you'll include your experience and that of your consortium partner. So, you're presenting it as a team that together you can implement this project and you can, cover all the technical and operational aspects required. History of performance or past performance that usually appears as an annex, and usually the template is provided by USAID or the donor, and its purpose is to describe specific projects that you've recently implemented relating to the scope of work. And this is where USAID, using this template, you'll see at the bottom on number 9, contact information. So USAID will actually use this information to contact staff who are familiar with your work and can speak to your performance. So it's just like, if you're applying for a job and they ask for references, they call those references because they want to make sure that, yes, you're saying you did a great job and you got all these results, but what did the donor or what did your prime partner think of the work that you did and how you implemented? And again, this can be requested for both the prime and for any consortium partner. So again, following the template, inserting the information and providing those contacts is very important. And then, reviewing the application. It's, a really important part of the putting your application together. You want to make sure that you define your review milestones. So deciding, on your calendar, at what point are you going to take a pause and have someone review that document. An important note here is that the donor can only review what's in the application. And, it's not based on if they know your organization or if they worked with you before. Yes, that can be in the back of their mind, but, USAID is running a very strict procurement process. And so any information that USAID is asking for or that you feel is important needs to be contained in those pages of the application. And you just need to make sure that you're following a consistent process for each review. Give reviewers instructions, let them know that, hey, we're a couple of pages over the page limit. Give us feedback on where we can, save space or cut information to make sure that we're in the prescribed page limits. And then it's important to identify staff who can serve as reviewers. So hopefully and usually these are staff that are outside of the proposal team. So perhaps it's your executive director or someone on your partner staff who hasn't been involved, who can, review the application with fresh eyes from an objective perspective and say, yes, you're meeting the evaluation criteria, or this is missing. You really need to go back and focus on this. So some examples of reviews, again, confirming your application is compliant with the donor requirements. Having someone really, go back to the RFA and look at your application and say, yes, you've met these requirements, you have the right font size, you have the right sections to respond to the evaluation criteria. Another review is predicting how the donor will evaluate your proposal and how to make improvements so you can get the maximum number of points for each section. So this would be someone going through the evaluation criteria and actually scoring each piece. So if the technical application is worth 50 points, how many points out of those 50 does that reviewer think you're going to get? You also need reviewers to look at the budget for accuracy and reasonableness of costs. To confirm your application is finalized and ready for submission, and performing after action reviews to discuss lesson learned and to make improvements to your processes. So these are, again, just examples of reviews that I've been involved in and have seen. And you really just have to tailor, the reviews to what is most applicable and useful for you in your process. All right, I know that was a lot of information, so I'm going to take a pause here to answer any questions you might have. So I might ask Melissa if she doesn't mind to point me to any questions that have been asked.
Yeah, there's a question here about additional criteria or indicators that an organization can use to determine whether it's eligible to apply as a prime or sub. So perhaps when looking at different opportunities, when would you know whether to kind of be a sub versus be a prime?
Yeah, I think it really just depends on, looking critically at your organization. What does your organization have capacity to do? Do you have the capacity to prime? Which being a prime means you're responsible to the donor for all the deliverables and results of the project. So, you're responsible for managing the budget, for, hiring and managing all of the staff, doing all of the reporting, et cetera, et cetera. So it really just, you have to be kind of honest and looking at what your abilities are. And if you haven't been a prime partner before, it might make sense to be a sub again or to partner, if it's an open competition opportunity where an INGO can apply, perhaps you partner with an INGO and during your partnership conversations agree that they're going to help build your capacity to, understand and put together an application, or and also during the project implementation that they'll work with you to build up your systems or to build your capacity to implement as a prime partner. That's something that you could negotiate with, an INGO prime. If you're working with, a peer organization that's a local organization, perhaps they've been a prime before, and they might, similarly agree to help build your capacity or answer questions or, share more of the responsibilities during project implementation. I think it's just very, very important to have, especially your finance and your operations staff involved, because they will be able to tell you, yes, we can meet these requirements. Yes, we can, meet these deadlines and follow all the rules and regulations that USAID requires. So I think it's just a matter of, case by case basis, how much funding you're able to manage, and kind of taking step by step each you know time you put in a proposal or pursue an activity, to build your capacity and have a plan towards getting to be a prime partner.
Great. The next question we have here is about, do you have any recommendations for performing a bid analysis for particular opportunities, how to calculate the probability of your success to determine how much effort and investment you should put into any one certain opportunity?
That's a good question. I know many INGOs have these sorts of processes. I'll be honest, I haven't, in my role in business development, been involved with those. Those are usually something that's done at a higher level. But I'm sure, if you were to go online and kind of Google, I'm sure you could probably find some sorts of templates that would, kind of have questions or prompts for you to think about. But that's again something that could go into your, if your organization has a resource mobilization plan, which is kind of your overall, how are we going to find resources to fund our mission and fund our programming? You might be able to find some tools or templates online particular to that. So I don't have any personally, and I haven't kind of seen any that I would be able to, share out with you. But I think that's something your leadership and your organization could definitely put together and maybe work with other organizations to see if they have suggestions.
Great. The next question is about reviewing. What's the best practice in terms of getting people to review your submission or your application?
Mhm.
Should the reviewers be from inside or outside of your organization?
Yeah, so usually I would suggest it's someone outside of your proposal team. So someone, on your staff who are not working on the proposal and seeing it every day. That could be an executive director or perhaps a director of another team, or another, technical expert. It's really key to have someone who is familiar with the donor, who maybe has, worked at another organization that worked with the donor a lot. I think it's important to kind of think about the profile of who's on your staff and who might not, be an obvious choice, but perhaps has come from another organization that worked on, USAID bids and can bring that. If you have partners you're working with, certainly, that could be part of your partnership agreement to review drafts. So you could have partners reviewing that. Um, you could also hire consultants, like myself or peers of mine, that's really specialize in USAID proposal reviews and can really look at compliance and make sure that you're hitting all of those criteria. I would say not to, engage someone, that you don't trust. Of course, looking at your proposal, it's proprietary information. It's, particular to your organization, and especially in competitive proposal situations, you don't want to share your proposal with folks that, you know, could take ideas or share ideas that they saw in your proposal with someone else. So you just want to be very discerning and make sure that that person is only working with you and is committed to helping you win.
Excellent. The next question is about, can you explain the difference between a consortium and a cluster in project implementation?
Oh, I haven't heard of cluster before, actually. I've heard it in terms of like technical folks. I don't know what cluster would mean in that sense, but a consortium, is kind of a fancy word to say, we have all of these, maybe you have two or three partners that you're working with or more. Very large projects, INGOs could have, 9 or 10 partners. So that would be the kind of definition of consortium. It's just, taken as a whole, all the partners that you're working with.
Great. The next question is it possible to change or modify the organogram or org chart during the implementation of the project after it's been submitted in a proposal? What is the possibility of leeway in terms of changing things after you've won an award?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't know, Melissa, since you're on the project side, if you have any input to this, but as far as I'm not as involved in the after award part, but I think definitely at award, there is time for negotiation with USAID on, perhaps, a key personnel is no longer available, or I guess I'm thinking by the time you're at award, nothing significant should have changed to really make your organizational chart change. But I think as the project is implemented, there is opportunity, I think when you're doing your yearly work plan and yearly reporting, that you can, have conversations with USAID to say, hey, especially if USAID has in any way changed the scope of work or has added work that wasn't in the original project, they're open to negotiating changes to your organizational chart and how you can implement the project.
Yeah, from the project perspective, I wasn't at ASAP at the start of the project.
Mm-hmm.
However, we've had people come and go throughout the course of the project. I think it's natural that your staff
Mm-hmm.
changes slightly. However, we haven't had any significant changes in key personnel. So I think that's something to consider. Obviously, people leave and come into organizations throughout the course of the project. So I think it's communicating with whoever is your COR managing from USAID managing the project to being in communication with them.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is about the writing and the technical approach. Is it okay to use other documents that you've come up with in the past? So examples of best practices or examples from other reports or blogs or whatever written
Mhm.
materials. Is there any concern around plagiarism for stuff like that, or can you use kind of things that you've done in the past?
Yeah, I think for any organization, you can, of course, use anything that you've used in the past. As we know, um, some requirements and technical applications don't really change from time to time. And as long as they're, owned by your organization. So I wouldn't say, go to another organization's website and pull, perhaps, language that they use for a particular strategy or approach that they use. You need to make sure that what you're submitting is owned by you, that your organization implements that type of work or uses a certain type of strategy to address a certain activity. But certainly use what you have available, what you've used with other donors or talked about with other stakeholders. USAID is really looking for evidence and best practices, and I think they're open to whatever you've previously come up with that you can demonstrate is effective and will result in achievements for the project. I think they're interested in that. Um, I think I might go ahead. There's probably other questions, Melissa, but I'm just watching the clock. We have a few more slides to get to, so maybe we can save the rest of the questions for the end.
No problem. There's just a few others, so we can go ahead and
Okay.
continue and we'll get back to them at the end.
Okay, yeah, we'll definitely get back to those questions. I just want to run through talking about the cost application, wrapping up the application, and then we'll get to the rest of the questions. So, and maybe some of these will answer questions that were here. So the cost application. So, you have your technical application and all those pieces that we talked about, but the technical and the cost application go hand in hand with one another. So we'll talk about some best practices here. Let's see. There we go. So again, an important part of the cost application is going back to the solicitation and review what the budget should look like, what it should include. Of course, use any provided templates from USAID or the donor. Usually for USAID, they're going to ask for an Excel file for the budget. And in the Excel file, it will show and calculate costs. So using formulas, punching in the numbers and, allocating numbers across, the years of the project, etc. And then a Word document for the budget narrative. So the budget narrative is meant to provide an explanation and rationale for your costs found in the budget. So the donor doesn't evaluate your budget like they do the technical application. It's really, if your application is technically sound, if it's scored high on the technical side, then they'll look at your budget and your cost application. And when the donor's reviewing your cost proposal and level of effort, they'll really be looking at three different points. So they're going to look and ask, are your costs reasonable? So are your costs generally recognized as ordinary and necessary? So an example is the rental rate for a venue to conduct a training is average. You're not, suggesting a high rental rate that's kind of out of the norm for that particular training. They're going to review if your costs are allocable. So are those costs incurred specifically for the award? They're only happening because the award exists. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing this type of activity. And an example is the project staff use 25% of the office space and the project pays 25% of the office rent. So you're not charging 100% of your office rent to this project because you have other projects and your staff are only taking up 25% of the office space. So you're just allocating what is applicable to that project. And then finally, they're going to look if your costs are allowable. So the costs are not disallowed by the terms of the award. So this goes back to, in your award, there are rules and regulations on what project can pay for. So an example is alcohol and entertainment are not allowed costs, so they cannot be covered by the grant. So, there are certain specific costs that USAID says, no, these are not things that can be paid for by the project. And again, close coordination with technical HR and operations team is key to successful budget development. You need to have everybody involved and everybody reviewing and inputting to make sure you're getting the most accurate budget possible. So this is just a budget and narrative example. Again, we don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty, but here is just, an example from an Excel budget sheet on travel, showing the kind of travel that you need to undertake for the project. So if you look at line 3.3, short-term technical assistance, this is covering expatriate and consultant flights. So you'll see that there's 15 round-trip airfares at $1,500 on average per flight. And, you can see in the budget narrative on the right side of the screen that this is what you would have in your Word document to explain what is happening in your budget Excel file. So it's just kind of recapping, what type of fares they are, why they cost that much, how many trips there are, and the purpose of the trips. In section 3.1.4, it talks about the per diem. So that's the lodging and M&IE for the trip, ground transportation. Again, this is recapping, per diem is based on the standard DSSR, the assumptions that have been made, the cost, etc. So, again, what's in the budget are the actual numbers and, how many days a trip is, how much the flights cost, how many flights a year are you taking, and that budget narrative is explaining in a narrative form what is happening and the justification for those costs so that USAID can understand, you're using the standard, DSSR per diem rate. It's not a made up number. It's something that USAID uses on a regular basis. And then a little bit about the 10% de minimis. So, in your application, you can cover your indirect costs. And most local partners that don't have a negotiated indirect cost rate may choose to use a de minimis rate of 10% of modified total direct costs. So, USAID encourages local partners to factor this cost into their budgets to make sure you're covering indirect rates and charges for your organization. This is just a very brief description, and I know the ASAP team has done more in-depth discussions on de minimis, so definitely look for those other resources. But to compute these rates, the modified total direct costs includes salaries and wages, fringe benefits, materials, supplies, travel, up to a certain amount. So this is what you can charge that 10% of de minimis on, is these type of charges. But then you cannot charge de minimis on, equipment, rental costs, tuition remission, scholarships, those types of things. So you just, have to work with your finance staff to, make sure you're charging your 10% de minimis and then it's being charged on the correct direct costs in your budget. And another thing that USAID will often ask for in your cost application is to show cost share. So I don't know if you hopefully have heard of cost share before, but it refers to resources a recipient contributes to the total cost of an agreement. So USAID, might say, there's 10% cost share required in this project. So that means 10% of the total budget allocation of the project, 10% of that must come from the recipient. Cost share becomes a condition of the award when it's approved, and it must be verified from the recipient's records, and it must be reported on throughout the life of the project. And it must be noted that only non-US government funds can count towards cost share. So you can't use another USAID project and say, okay, well, use some activities that will contribute to this project. They're all coming from the US government, so those funds cannot count towards cost share. It has to come from outside of US government funds. So perhaps if you have donor funding from Sweden and they're working on, HIV issues in the same community, you could leverage that same programming. And cost share can and should be flow down to sub-partners, although recognizing there are risks to that. Just need to, make sure you're thinking about any risks that could come from asking partners to contribute, because again, this is a condition of the award. It's required to be reported on, so you have to be able to prove and report on what you're able to bring in for cost share. I know these slides are maybe a little bit small, but these are just a couple of kind of summaries on what cost share is. The background, it's a legislative, there's no requirement that USAID has to ask for this. But USAID might choose to require it. But there's not any really set formula to determine this, and the cost share must be stated in the announcement. So, it will always be outlined in the solicitation if cost share is required. If it's not mentioned, it's not required. And it's not something that USAID can come back during the project and say, hey, you have to do cost share now. They have to set that out at the very beginning. And if you're not able to meet the cost share requirements, USAID might have to take some actions, which include reducing your funding from USAID to account for that shortfall, require the recipient to refund the difference, or they can choose to reduce the cost share. If it's challenging for you to meet that requirement, that might be something that USAID would allow you to reduce. And there are different ways to account for cost share. So it could be volunteer services, donating employee time, donated supplies, cash contributions, donated equipment, project co-funding. So again, I know this is pretty brief, but just wanted to flag that in case you hadn't seen or heard of it before. USAID has different resources on this. So if you were to Google cost share USAID, there would be resources popping up for that. So just wanted to flag to make sure you were aware of that. And so we'll spend a couple of slides talking about the different potential award mechanisms that USAID might use with local partners. So one is a cooperative agreement, which hopefully you're familiar with, especially if you've been a sub-partner to an INGO. INGOs are usually awarded cooperative agreements. So a cooperative agreement is a type of grant that has certain rules and regulations that go with how you implement it and how you work with USAID. So cooperative agreements provide for substantial involvement between USAID and the recipient during the implementation of the activity. And substantial involvement may include the approval, USAID would approve your implementation plans. USAID would approve your key personnel, and USAID would, probably collaborate with the partner on different activities throughout the award. So examples of that could be, USAID might want to be involved in the selection of an advisory committee members for a project. USAID would likely approve your subawardees. So, whatever partners you want to work with on the project, USAID would have to approve those. And USAID would review, for example, your monitoring and evaluation plan or other plans, implementation plans as you're implementing the project. So just to say that cooperative agreements are one mechanism that USAID uses as awards. Another award that you might be familiar with is a fixed amount award, an FAA. So these are appropriate when the program scope has a specific and measurable goals and objectives, and there's adequate data to estimate costs and develop the budget. FAAs do not require the prime to monitor actual costs incurred, as all costs are covered by an agreed upon milestone payments. And a milestone is a description of the task, deliverable, or a goal to be accomplished. So hopefully you have received one of these before or are familiar with them. And I think, again, perhaps ASAP has done some work with local partners on this piece. But just a small example to fit in the time we have left. And a fixed amount award, this is an example of a 6-month project budget for an FAA. So, for fun, the project is to identify the best soup recipes in 5 provinces and train people to make. So as you can see, it's a month by month proposal budget. So you're saying month by month, how much will it take to identify these soup recipes and train people? So as you can see, it includes salaries and travel, supplies, the activity costs, and the 10% de minimis there at the bottom. So for each month, you're saying this is how much money it would take for us to implement these particular activities. And by the end of the 6 months, the total budget is $49,995. So spread out over 6 months. These are the milestones that the project is reaching. So as you can see, activity 1, doing a survey in those first 3 months, January through March. And then the training of the people to make the soup is taking place from April to May. So again, this is just a very simplified example of an FAA project budget. Of course, the activities and things that you all do as local partners is much more complicated than this, but for the purposes of our discussion today, just wanted to provide you with a simple example. And moving on, so okay, we've put our budget together, we've done our technical application. Now it's time, a deadline is approaching and we really need to work towards finalizing our application. So when you're finalizing your application, it's really important, 1 or 2 days before submission, conducting a final review. And again, this is really, looking at your compliance. So is your format correct? Is your application within the page limit? Does it have the right font size, paper size, page numbers, etc.? And ensuring the content is compliant with what the solicitation is asking for and meeting those evaluation criteria. So, again, this is part of a review that should have happened before, as you don't want to find out 1 or 2 days before submission that your technical application isn't meeting the requirements. So you really want to be sure, to check those as the calendar chugs along. But, that final check, just in case something got deleted or, something strange happened with the Word file. You just want to make sure on that last review that everything is there that's supposed to be there. And then about a day before submission, conducting a final copy edit just for correct spelling and grammar. Again, it's really important that this document is putting your best foot forward. It doesn't have to be perfect. You could work on a proposal for 6 months, and I guarantee you after submission, you would still find errors or mistakes. and that's okay. But you just want to make sure, this is a document that's representing you and your organization and your partners. And you want to make sure that final document is really putting your best foot forward and showing USAID your attention to detail and, how much time and effort you put into this application. And one key piece of advice I would give is to submit your application to the donor at least one business day before the deadline to ensure it's received on time. As we're emailing these very large documents, mishaps can happen. Things can sit in your outbox. Your internet, your electricity and your internet can go out at the last minute. You just don't want to leave anything until 5 minutes before the deadline in case something like that happens. You want time to submit it and time for the donor to confirm that they've received it by the deadline. And most importantly, be sure to build these final steps into your calendar. If you think back to that slide I displayed, working back from that final deadline, you really want to make sure that you're building in time and that your proposal team, when you say, hey, send me the final proposal we're going to submit today, and your team's like, what are you talking about? We still have a day, to work on this. And, you say, no, you don't. So just to make sure it's built into the final steps on your calendar, that your whole proposal team knows that this is the plan, so they're not caught off guard. And again, you're submitting your application. It's really important to ask for confirmation that USAID or the donor has received your submission emails and that they can open all of the attachments. Sometimes files get corrupted, or worst case scenario, you forgot to attach something. So you just really want to make sure that, everything is in that email that needs to be according to the requirements, that you're not missing anything. If you're using Outlook, you can use delivery. You can ask for delivery receipts that'll give you an email from the server that says, this was delivered. That doesn't necessarily mean the contact person has opened your email, but making sure that it's out of your outbox, it's in your sent mail. Another best practice is on that submission email, make sure to CC others at your organization who can, confirm, yep, it came into my inbox, it's sitting there right now. Because you just want to make sure it goes through and then there weren't any issues. And finally, ensure that the attachments are less than the megabyte size limit. So often USAID in the solicitation will say, the email can't be over 10 megabytes or 20 megabytes. And sometimes these, especially your cost application, can be quite large. So you just want to make sure that everything is going through. And if they're over the size limit, you can send your application in multiple emails. You just have to label them appropriately so that USAID knows what they can find in each of those emails. And okay, you've submitted the proposal, everyone's relieved, you've worked so hard on it for several weeks or months. But the work doesn't end just when you hit submit. There's some things that you can do after submission to make sure that you're prepared for, when USAID comes back, or lessons learned for the next application you put together. So one thing we like to do is debrief with your proposal team and discuss how you might improve your process for the next time you apply. Were there any gaps, or were there challenges that your team faced, or did you lack any resources, or, was something forgotten about that, you realized, too late or late in the process? So just really getting the feedback from your team on how the process went and how you can improve for next time. You can also take time after submission to prepare for USAID to come back with any questions or clarifications. I think this happens especially with the budget is, were there things at the end that you had to cut? or reduce, activities so you can meet the budget ceiling. Those kind of happen in those last few days. So are there things that you think USAID might ask us a question about that or wonder why we did that? So just kind of having justification for certain decisions that you made kind of written out and on hand just in case. Or especially if staff leave or are on leave or traveling, and they're not there when USAID comes back to having their input or remember this is why we did that can be important at that point. And if USAID notifies you that you weren't successful, you should really request in writing a debrief or a copy of USAID's evaluation of your application. Usually you have to request this within 10 days of notification from USAID. And this is really important to get so that you have from USAID or the donor an understanding of why they did not award you or why you did not score well on a certain section of your application. USAID will provide that in writing, or they might have a meeting with you and give it verbally. So just really making sure that you ask for that feedback so you can take that again and take those lessons learned and feedback and apply it to your next proposal submission. Like I said, using this feedback to build your expertise, enhance your systems, and reassess the alignment with donor priorities. So if the donor says, you missed the mark on suggesting this type of activity, we don't, think that's the best way to go about this, then you can, take that to rethink or reassess, why you might have suggested something in your application. And so that's the end of the presentation. Again, I know that was a lot, so we'll get back into any questions you have, or if you want to share any of your own lessons learned from proposal applications, feel free to share.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. We have a few questions here. The first is around moving from being a sub to a prime. When you're preparing and looking through different opportunities, does the budget that you've managed in the past as a sub, the size of it, have a bearing on the prospects of becoming a prime? So is that something you should consider when looking at opportunities? How might you include that in your proposal?
Yeah, so I think that's really a question internally for your organization. If you've managed, an award for $1 million and you're looking at a potential award of $5 million, what is your internal capacity to increase, your ability to manage that much more funding? So I think it's really looking at your systems and talking with your finance and operations staff to say, hey, can we absorb, this much funding? Or, have we been able to manage partner budgets in the past and allocate budgets to partners? I think it's really an examination internally of if you have the systems and the processes in place to properly manage and meet all the requirements of funding that USAID and CDC and other US agencies have. They're pretty strict about the types of rules and regulations that you have to meet and reporting requirements. And so there's a lot to really take in and consider. But if your organization is ready to grow and has systems in place to be able to scale up to manage significantly more funds, then I think there are opportunities there for you to stretch and take on more and work with USAID to be able to become a prime.
Great, thanks. The next question is about the difference in milestones between an FAA and a fixed price contract. Might you kind of give us a little bit of details around the difference between those two types of awards?
I'll be honest, I don't work on the project side at all. So a fixed price contract, I mean, for contracts in general, there's just a lot more strict rules and regulations that an organization has to meet. I would say with a fixed amount award, it's a grant, and you're working with USAID. I think fixed amount awards were kind of are a great type of award to work with local partners who might be new to prime funding, with the milestones that are in place and not having to kind of front um, funds to implement activities. Oftentimes contracts are reimbursable. The organization has to implement activities and then USAID will reimburse them. Um, and Melissa, if you have any insight into this, please chime in. But I think, for local partners, I think an FAA is most manageable, given, USAID understands that local organizations might not have all of the systems and processes and policies in place to take on contracts, which have a lot more requirements and reporting requirements and procedures. So I think the FAA is it's a bit more flexible and can be negotiated with USAID more easily.
Yeah, I don't have any additional context other than to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rebecca, but we did a webinar in January where we had additional presenters that I think gave a little bit more context into
Mhm.
this. So I can put the link in the chat for that.
Yeah.
And that's a great resource to go to. There's a separate set of presentation slides that are similar but slightly different to these, as well as a recording where we had additional speakers speak to some of the differences and milestones who do work on the project side. So that might be a helpful resource to you as you are preparing any proposals. We have a question here about, can you, after you've submitted your proposal, can you recall it if you need to make adjustments? How does that work if you notice an error or things like that?
Yeah, so that does happen from time to time. And this is again a great reason to submit a day or two before the deadline so that if you do see a mistake or need to make a correction, USAID usually even has instructions within the RFA, that if you need to submit a corrected version, that you kind of note that in your submission to let USAID know which is the correct version that they should be reviewing. I know in Outlook, depending on what type of email application you use, you can recall emails, but sometimes it doesn't get recalled properly or it might still go through. So I think it would just be very important, you still have to submit it before the deadline and to make sure that you're very clear with USAID, this is a corrected application. Please disregard the email sent at whatever time. Please use this as the corrected version. So you just have to be very clear. But hopefully, I would only say you would need to do that if there's really a glaring mistake or you sent the wrong version, you sent a draft version instead of the final. If it's minor mistakes, typos, an incorrect number here or there, I mean, like I said before, you could keep looking at a proposal and it will never be exactly perfect, but the saying goes, an imperfect proposal delivered on time can win, but a perfect proposal delivered after the deadline will never win. USAID will not look at your proposal after that deadline. So making sure they have something to review by the deadline is really, really important.
Um, Thanks. I think that is all of the questions related to business development. There's been several questions about cost principles and very specific examples about what's allowable and what isn't. So I've sent a link in the chat that we did with Doug Frankie
Mhm.
that talked really in depth about cost principles related to USAID funded projects. So that might be a great resource for all of you who have questions about the specifics of what should and should not be included in terms of USAID rules and regulations. So I think just to save on a little bit of time, and also he's an expert in those kinds of things. He also discussed the de minimis in detail in that webinar. So if you have questions about that, I'll send it again so that it's the newest link in the chat. But that's an excellent place to find answers to those kinds of questions. And Doug is also very open to people asking questions, and his contact information is in those webinars. So if anyone has any additional questions, please ask them now. If not, I think we have one more small poll, if I'm not mistaken, Becky.
Okay. Shall we go ahead and do the last poll question? So we have one more poll question before we let you go, just to see how valuable you found this webinar. So do you feel more confident at the end of this? Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry, I was just marking a question in the
Oh, okay.
Zoom. Yeah,
Sorry.
sorry about that.
So our last poll question, do you feel more confident at the end of this webinar to pull a compliant application together for future submissions? So again, this is on a scale of 1 to 5 of your confidence level. So 1 is no confidence at all, and 5 is very confident. So if you can just add your feelings at the end of this webinar, we'd love to hear.
We'll give people about just 10 more seconds.
All right, so our poll responses, we have a lot in 4, which is pretty confident. We have some 5s. We do have some 3s, and a 1. So I'm glad to see that no one feels, not confident at all. And hopefully, what we've covered today has given you some new ideas or best practices to implement in your proposal application processes. So thanks all for sharing that. And here is just some contact information for more details on ASAP. We have here our USAID contracting officer representative, our project directors, Catherine Brokenshire Scott. Again, the website can all be found on IntraHealth's ASAP resources page. And that's the end. So thank you all so much for joining and for your time today and all the great questions. I wish you all the best of luck in putting your proposals together and for getting funding from USAID. Thank you so much.
And thanks, of course, to Rebecca for joining us today and presenting such an excellent webinar. We also like to thank USAID for continuing to fund these webinar series. It's an excellent resource for all of you, and I've just again put the link in the chat for our website where you can find today's webinar as well as many past webinars that we've mentioned today and several other resources that are available. There's some manuals and tools that are available for all of you to use and to share with your colleagues. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Rebecca, for such an excellent presentation, and we hope to see you at another ASAP webinar soon. Thank you very much, everyone.